his talk on Agadah in Levinas, much as Levinas himself began many of his Talmudic discourses by apologizing for my very presence, an unexperienced tyro in matters connected with Levinas before you. But let me embroider on Levinas's habitual opening. First, a revision. Levinas frequently apologizes for his exclusive treatment of Agadic texts. Actually, many of his lessons focus on halachic texts, as a quick examination of his lessons reveals. So it is more accurate to say that Levinas treats all his texts, including the halachic ones, agadically. All texts are grist for the agadic mill. He is not interested in the halachic issue or the halachic discourse itself. I shall return to this characteristic of his work later on. I find Levinas's frequent opening confession of incompetence, indeed his somewhat mealy-mouthed petition to be allowed to speak, somewhat irritating. It can be taken seriously, I think, only as ritual. Indeed, I think his opening apologies and his opening request to be allowed to speak, I think it instantiates the liturgic ritual recommended by the Talmud upon entering the house of study to teach. And I'll just read this to you in Hebrew, and I think you'll see what I mean. Wait a minute. What does a person say when he comes into the Beit Midrash to teach? Hashem Elokai, shelo ye'era dvar takala al yadi, v'lo ekashel bidvar halacha, v'yismechu bi chavirai. As Rashi explains here, v'yismechu bi chavirai, my fellows will rejoice when I make mistakes, which is, of course, normally the dynamic of teaching in the Beit Midrash. And this is what the person entering the Beit Midrash to teach says. I think this is what Levinas is saying before each of his Talmudic ventures, or each of his Talmudic lessons, so that Levinas does not petition God, but his fellow students. But the basic uncertainty from which he prays to be relieved, the basic fear of error remains. Thus, Levinas identifies his teaching with that of the traditional Jewish sage, and its venue as that of the traditional house of study, the Beit Midrash. The context for Levinas really then is a context of commitment from the very beginning on. And I think if we're determined to read Levinas Jewishly, which is what I'll be trying to do some of what this morning, if we're determined to read Levinas Jewishly, then we have to place him in the Jewish context from the very beginning, which is from the way he enters the site of the teaching itself. He's entering a Beit Midrash, or at least he is creating a virtual Beit Midrash around his own teaching. And though Levinas generally focuses on the propriety of his teaching before his betters, thus usurping their role, his true anxiety derives from the fear that these betters will reject his interpretations and correct him in public, much as the Talmudic sage fears that his competitive colleagues will rejoice in me, yismechu bi, that is, celebrate his errors. Both situations, that of Levinas and that of the Talmudic passage, reflect the agonistic character of traditional Talmud study. In another instance, Levinas confesses to fearing that those studying earlier in the day the very same text he had prepared to teach later in the day would say about it what I myself had prepared to say. A typical anxiety of the traditional Talmudists, and those who read the Talmudic work know very well that a frequent refrain of the Talmudist writing his work is to say, I thought of this before somebody else did, but he just published it ahead of me. But I really had the idea. I don't think you find that in any other field of study. A person defending the propriety of what he's saying against somebody else who presumably said it ahead of you. Okay? The fear that somebody else said something ahead of you is a traditional Talmudic fear. I wish to make one further comment on Levinas's self-image as teacher of Talmudic texts. We are all aware of Levinas's vehement rejection of historicism, a rejection which included philological and critical method as well. Levinas's insistence on methodological rigor and purity, and I've always had the suspicion, which I have no way of demonstrating because I don't really know enough about the situation, that the people who studied with the mythical Mar Shoshani, and we know the names of some of the people, went on then to be very anti-critical in their readings of the Talmud. anti-historical, anti-critical, anti-philological. I don't want to go through the names because some of them are good friends of mine. I don't want to sound as though I'm accusing them. But I just wonder whether part of the intellectual baggage which Shoshani passed on to his students included an anti-critical mode of looking at Talmud. Because consistently, each of the people who studies with Shoshani is not only non-critical, but anti-critical very vehemently, including Levinas. Levinas's insistence, now I'll get back to my basic text, Levinas's insistence on methodological rigor and purity testifies, it seems to me, to the seriousness with which he takes his Talmudic ventures. The Agadic texts which serve as his points of departure easily serve as homiletical stimuli, but Levinas insists by his methodological polemic that he is not producing homilies or sermonizing. Rather, he is committed to the validity of his specific reading of the Talmudic text, no less than he is committed to the validity of his philosophical analysis. Levinas's consciousness of this complexity is indicated in his reflections on method. Thus, in reflecting on the Talmudic reading of Esther 9:27 in the Temptation of Temptation, and on his own concomitant reading of the Talmudic text itself, Levinas notes the persistence, and I quote, of a permanent dissonance between what the Talmud draws from the biblical text and what is found in that text literally. That's in the 9 readings. But this awareness is not extended to his own reading of the same Talmud text. Here he describes his efforts to translate, and I quote again, translate Talmudic discourse into modern language, to draw from an elusive and enigmatic mode of speaking a few schematic representations. His own work with the Talmud produces a translation, but no dissonance. In other words, Levinas encourages, or acknowledges rather, that the rabbinic relationship to Scripture is tendentious and even manipulative, but claims that his own relationship to rabbinic literature uncovers its objective meaning. Interestingly, Levinas finds his rejection of historicism and philology present in the Talmudic texts themselves. Examination of these, as read by Levinas, will be instructive as we shall see the seriousness with which Levinas produces his Talmudic readings, as well as the vehemence with which he rejects the historical philological method. The text that I'm going to focus on for a few minutes is taught by Levinas as containing 2 pieces of information. We're dealing with the text which deals with the Tumat Kitvei HaKodesh, namely the fact that scrolls of the Torah or of the rest of the Bible fundamentally become impure and then will force their impurity on anybody who touches them. So we have 2 pieces of information. One, Torah scrolls are declared impure so as to prevent their being stored in the proximity of Trumah. You wouldn't put the Torah scrolls near Trumah because they would communicate the impurity to the Trumah. A practice which led to their being eaten by the rats which were attracted by the food. Once the Torah scrolls were near the food, the rats which came to eat the food would also nibble at the Torah scrolls. This is a very interesting concept altogether in the history of religions. 2, this impurity is transmitted to the hands of one who touched the scrolls. Now, Levinas reads this admittedly non-prosaic text through the lenses of a number of rhetorical yet transformative queries. Is it certain, he says, that the nakedness of the scroll only means the absence of a covering around the parchment, literal nakedness? I am not sure that that absence of covering does not already symbolize a different nakedness. And is the hand just a hand, and not also a certain impudence of spirit that seizes a text savagely, without preparation or teacher, without precautions, without mediation, without all that has been acquired through a long tradition, touched by the impatient, busy hand that is supposedly objective and scientific? The Scriptures, cut off from the breath which lives within them, become false or mediocre words, matters for linguists and philologists. Therein lies the impurity of these sacred texts, their latent impurity. In other words, if I would just add a word of interpretation here, texts or scrolls or texts have a latent impurity. The impurity which the sages declare to rest, to inhere in the scrolls, is not something new, but it's simply releasing the latent impurity in all texts, because all text can be seized upon by the naked hand of the philologist. So this is very clever. This is really very clever what Levinas is doing. But nonetheless, the ultimate method is to say that the philologist, the critical scholar, is really seizing the text, which is almost begging to be seized, but nonetheless would rather not be seized by him, and in its nakedness, communicating the impurity. The critical scholar, he who approaches his text as a naked individual, has abandoned the community as a readership, let alone a sustaining fellowship. All this, of course, is achieved by a conceptualizing of the concrete Talmudic text. Is this too not an abandonment of the communal reading, which of course didn't read the Talmudic text Hasidically, let's put it, but read it halachically? Indeed, Levinas himself acknowledges, and I quote again, that, quote, nakedness is not nakedness, the covering is not a covering, the hand is not a hand, the rat is not a rat. Very good translation. Yet the use of these brutal terms as metaphors for the historian and the philologist shocks and repels. Levinas seems always almost out of control. A rat is not a rat. Levinas has himself proposed that in the incessant labors of scholars there may be heard a sound resembling the gnawing of rodents. I think Levinas is on more wholesome ground when he speaks of the proper mode of reading Talmudic texts. Levinas would argue that this mode, too, the proper mode, is not shared by the Western scholar, but his explicit goal then is not to derogate, but to point a positive note. Contrasting himself with the ideal reader, Levinas writes that to his regret, he is not able, and I quote, to make the whole of the text vibrate in the text study, as is demanded and as is natural in advanced study of the Talmud. He uses the phrase, the sewing back together. Furthermore, and in harmony with the above, he announces that he is attempting to extricate the unity of the various themes, to seek out the coherence of the text and the harmony of the various themes evoked. This is from beyond the verse. These are, of course, the values of the non-critical scholar, the whole whose parts are in mutual vibration, unity, harmony, coherence. Needless to say, these terms clash with the critical enterprise and its ambition, too. For example, the word tamid, which we'll come back to, which in biblical law, the always preferred by the biblical Jew of the tamid, as in the lechem hapanim, contrasts with the historical meaning in Levinas's reading. Its tamid is permanence, not tamid as constantly there. The always preferred by the biblical Jew contrasts with the historical meaning, which relativizes and devalues every moment. Once again, by positioning himself in conflict with critical scholarship, Levinas not only announces his methodological preferences, he asserts that his competing reading is no less serious, ambitious, and authentic than theirs. He is not a mere homilist. Is Levinas a serious reader of Talmudic texts? Let me rephrase the question. Can Levinas's readings be seen as part of the ongoing project of Jewish Bible reading and study? I would have little difficulty fitting him in as a homilist or a preacher, though idiosyncratic in some ways. The homilist or preacher has little difficulty converting the text at hand into a moral lesson. But Levinas aspires to more. He provides a conceptual reading of his text, whether biblical or Talmudic, and translates concrete particulars into a universal idiom. A good example is provided by the term tamid, referred to above. Its biblical source is the instruction that the showbread be before me continually, tamid. Levinas expounds the term as espousing the value of permanence, a value then placed in opposition to the historical. Levinas has simply transmuted the halachic imperative continuality, which refers to a concrete object or event, into the value of conceptual permanence. This fundamentally is the mode of reading preferred in the tradition of philosophical exegesis, that of Maimonides, and before him, Philo of Alexandria, a tradition which has not been hegemonic, but which nonetheless cannot be declared inauthentic. And for the same reason, I think, Levinas is not hegemonic, but I think you cannot call him inauthentic. To put it somewhat differently, traditional biblical commentary and homiletics would frequently read the text typologically, but this remained concrete even as it exchanged one event for another. Thus, patterns of patriarchal life prefigure that of the people of Israel, but each is equally concrete. nor does one deny the other. Furthermore, classic Jewish interpretation has no difficulty with the non-universal translation, even when it produces an abstract value. So, to choose an instance out of hundreds or thousands, Leviticus Rabbah understood Ecclesiastes 4:6 better as a handful of quietness than both the hands full of labor, as talking about a student of Torah's overextending his scholarly ambition as contrasted with true mastery. God's devastating presence in Egypt is contrasted with Moses and Aaron's bringing the curse of soot upon the Egyptians. The Sabbath contrasted with the 6 days of work. The world to come in contrast with this world. And finally and dramatically, the handful of flour given as a free will meal offering of the poor as contrasted with the finely ground incense of spices of the congregation. All of this is classical midrash. It all takes the biblical text and retranslates it into something concrete but nonetheless meaningful on a different plane. The last instance, by the way, of the handful of flour given as a free meal offering of the poor, this last instance, with its ethical thrust, could easily be appropriated by Levinas, but it is clear that the Midrash focuses on the poor of Israel, much as the other instances focused on the Jewish experience. I am inclined to think that Levinas would not stop at the poor of Israel, but would go further to a more universal kind of statement. In his analysis of the Talmudic passage discussed above, Levinas asserts that nakedness is not nakedness, a covering is not a covering, a hand is not a hand, the rat is not a rat. In this last instance, the rat, which is not a rat, Levinas could not resist having his cake and eating it too, both preserving the rat as a rat and recognizing it as a hysteros, a scholar. But by and large, Levinas's readings accomplish the transformation entirely. With Philo too, we escape the domain of the concrete and the particular by entering the domain of the abstract and universal. Levinas cannot then be denied his place as a Jewish thinker, simply by virtue of the fact that he interprets Torah. That's perhaps a too quick definition of what a Jewish thinker is, somebody who interprets Torah. But when you think about it, it includes almost everybody, maybe even Spinoza, which I think is usually the problematic case. In any case, with Philo, too, we escape the domain of the concrete and the particular by entering the domain of the abstract and universal. Levinas cannot then be denied his place as a Jewish thinker, simply by virtue of the fact that he interprets Torah. Yet the form of his interpretation, its ideational structure, and perhaps even its monochromatic content, relegates him to the fringes of Jewish interpretation, much as Philo is relegated to that dimension of Jewish hermeneutics, and in a sense, so was Maimonides. I will suggest an even more hazardous parallel to Levinas's mode of reading, or at least one that I would suggest to readers more versed in modern Jewish scholarship than I am. So this is just a suggestion to be followed up by those who know and those who might think there's something to it. The Kabbalistic Hasidic strain in Jewish hermeneutics frequently reads the concrete biblical reference in abstract terms, though of course their abstractions are not those of Levinas. I am not suggesting historic influence on Levinas, it's simply pointing to a useful parallel. Similarly, it has been claimed that Levinas views prayer as prayer for the other, and indeed for God, rather than for the one who prays for himself. This, of course, is also a popular Hasidic perspective. Now, I am fully aware that Levinas most explicitly relates to Judaism through its rational, non-mystical, and let's say non-mythical dimensions, in the Lithuanian mode, in other words. He himself makes reference to this preference, and his biographers provide supporting materials by noting his birth and upbringing in Kovna, home of Lithuanian Talmudism. But I am not suggesting that Levinas was influenced by Hasidism, much as I did not claim that he read and absorbed Philo. The point is simply that these masters might provide a parallel to his own hermeneutic. At the same time, it may be suggested that too much ought not be made of the patrimony of Kovna as a historical biographical determinant. In other words, you can squeeze just so much out of the fact that Levinas grew up in Kovna. The question is not was Levinas in Kovna, but was Kovna in Levinas? That's a more serious question. Now, at this point, I wish to note a number of typical Levinasian readings and suggest how, despite their apparent incongruity, they can be cited through the prism of a more traditional, though not commonplace Jewish hermeneutic. I hardly mean to suggest this method for all of Levinas's readings, I do think, though, that the examples I will give can provide an opening for further discussion. Levinas's essay, The Temptation of Temptation, devolves from the Talmudic passage Shabbat 88a and 88b. This passage begins with a famous legend according to which God upended Sinai above the heads of the people Israel, threatening them that if they did not agree to accept the Torah, he would crush them under the mountain. This is an extremely popular Agadah, partly because it was quoted by Rashi, which really determined the survival of Jewish ideas in the Jewish peoplehood. But nonetheless, there seems to be something very attractive in the idea of being threatened in order to receive Torah. The element of fear as an element of Jewish religious consciousness, I think, comes through and is therefore very much appreciated. So God threatened the people Israel that if they did not accept the Torah, he would crush them under the mountain. The Talmud then challenges, if the Torah were accepted by coercion, how is it binding? The solution is then provided, namely, that the holiday of Purim celebrates the Jewish free acceptance of the Torah. Most Jewish interpretation of this sequence is devoted to the legitimating change which took place at Purim, meaning from a scriptural religion to an oral religion, though some is also focused on the fact that until Purim, late in the biblical canon, the Torah ought have been of questionable legitimacy as a normative document. Levinas relates to the original legend, as though challenged by the normative perspective, how is it binding then, did provide an authentic, if different, point of view. Indeed, the mountain upended has captivated Jewish readership from Midrashic times on. The Torah, according to this Agadah, was accepted, as far as Levinas reads it, the Torah was accepted under the conversion, assuming that the threat of death is enough to invalidate or at least skew the possibility of choice. Levinas finds his perspective, the perspective of coercion, much to his liking. He argues, and this is a translation, the teaching, which the Torah is, cannot come to the human being as a result of choice. That which must be received in order to make freedom of choice possible, namely the Torah itself, cannot have been chosen unless after the fact. In the beginning was violence. In the beginning was coercion. This lack of free acceptance coheres well with another teaching found in the same Talmudic discussion, one which tells that the Jews first said, we will do, and only afterwards we will hear. So as to say, to receive the gift of the Torah, a law, is to fulfill it before consciously accepting it, practicing before adhering. Now this reflection on the possibility and necessity of choice does not seem characteristic of traditional Jewish exegesis. By and large, the image of the mountain held above the people is understood to represent the experience of revelation itself, an experience which compels those subject to it. The metaphor is not generally understood as denying the intrinsic possibility of choice in receiving the Torah, or the intrinsic possibility of choice within the Jewish religious halachic experience. And so, in this sense, Levinas, by focusing on the lack of choice, is focusing on something which may be very familiar, but nonetheless very questionable as an authentic Jewish reading of that Agadah. But that evaluation of mine would be a rush to judgment. Here is Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague, the Maharal of Prague. Here is his parsing of that same Talmudic passage. The upending of the mountain over their heads was so that the Israelites should not say, we accepted the Torah of our own volition, of our own choice. And if we did not want it, we would not have accepted it. This would not have been to the honor of the Torah. For the existence of the whole world derives from and depends on the Torah, so that it would not have been fitting for the existence of the Torah to depend on the choice of Israel, but rather that God obligated and compelled them to receive the Torah. How could the Torah, which is the perfection of existence, be dependent on the choice of the people Israel? So that the perfection of the world would depend on something which is contingent, meaning that the people might choose to accept the Torah and might choose not to accept it. And therefore he held the mountain above their heads to eliminate the possibility of choice. Now, one could continue to discuss this, but the parallel to Levinas is very clear. And in fact, Dr. Alan Jatkowitz, I don't think he's here, a day or two ago pointed me in the direction of an essay by Larry Kaplan, which appeared some 5 or 6 years ago, telling of this parallel between Levinas and Maharal on this passage. So at least the parallel has been noticed, but I think neither of them, in this sense, Levinas nor Maharal, are fundamentally in the mainstream understanding of the Jewish attitude towards free will and choice as being an absolute necessity in terms of religious value. So one could say, well, that reads Levinas in, or one could say that reads the Maharal out. But they are both fundamentally in the same, I think, in the same bailiwick. Maharal indeed reads out Talmudic discussion as rejecting choice in the receiving of the Torah by the people of Israel. His major consideration seems to be that the necessary is more sublime than that which is not. So the Torah must be necessary and not contingent. Certainly not contingent on the will of human beings. Now the value of the necessary in religious medieval thought is very, very clear. If you take the Rambam at the very beginning, and the Rambam got it from elsewhere, the idea that that which is necessary is more sublime than that which is contingent is a basic concept. And so Maharal is picking it up out of the metaphysics and turning it into an agadic mode. Or you might say using the Agadah to fundamentally buttress the metaphysics in the long run. But in any case, the idea that the necessary is more sublime than that which is not, so the Torah must be necessary and not contingent, certainly not contingent on the will of human beings. This is rather different than the sort of considerations that move Levinas. But the overall reading, indeed the overall sensibility, a sensibility which ranks the necessary above the chosen, seems less alien once one reads it through this Agadah. Occasionally, the concerns that move Levinas do seem even Talmudic. At the same time, and now I'm coming to the end, at the same time we must be wary of his agenda and of his tendentiousness. Take, for example, his essay, Judaism and Revelation, which opens the door to another concern of Levinas I haven't touched on, but perhaps others will or did, namely Levinas and Marxism, Levinas and the proletariat, and so on and so forth. And so we have an essay, Judaism and Revolution, which relates to a Mishnah dealing with the hiring of laborers and their conditions of employment. That's in the New Readings, or at least the translation called the New Readings. Levinas deals here with halachic material, though the analysis, to be sure, is not halachic. The centerpiece of the Mishnah is the following incident. One day, Rabbi Yochanan ben Matya said to his sons, "Go hire some workers." The son included food among the conditions of employment. When he came back, the father said, "My son, even if you prepared a meal for them equal to the one King Solomon served, you would not have fulfilled your obligation towards them. For they are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As long as they have not begun to work, go and specify, before the contract takes effect, go and specify you are only entitled to bread and dry vegetables." This is what's being done to the grandchildren of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, no less. But Levinas doesn't read it that way. Not unsurprisingly, Levinas reads these materials as establishing the rights of the other. His truly acute reading lies in his noticing that the rights of the worker are not established by the contract but antedated. The other man's right is practically an infinite right, he writes. Even if I had the treasures of Solomon at my disposal, I would still not be able to fulfill my obligations. The contract is more concerned with limiting my duties than with defending my rights. That Levinas completely misreads here. The obligation to provide the workers with food is not part of an infinite duty towards them, but is rather constructed by the fact that the son had included food among the conditions of employment, as the Mishnah states. Had that not occurred, the son would not be obliged to them and would also not have had to recontract with them, and certainly would not have had to feed them anything. Now, Levinas was not unaware of this aspect of the Mishnah, and I don't want to go into his full discussion. He hints at this aspect of the Mishnah, but he overlooked it in order to drive home his ethical vision. Elsewhere, of course, Levinas's tendentiousness, always present, is not so completely devastating of the text he treats. But he does, in Samuel Moyne's phrase, exploit his text. This phenomena, however, is thoroughly typical of philosophical exegesis, think again of Philo and Maimonides, and should not become a criterion for judging the exegete's work, though it may well determine the response it generates in many a reader. I would want to conclude with something which isn't in the text, but an article which was written some time ago, actually in 2003, denying Levinas's legitimacy as an authentic reader of Jewish Midrash or Judaism altogether, because he came to Talmudic texts late in his life. He did not receive a traditional Talmudic education, etc., etc., etc. There's a whole list of quotations which one can produce here. He did not come from a Talmudic background or receive a youthful introduction to Talmud. This is a paper in Proof Text 23. Here I would really have to disagree. One knows many people who've come to Talmud late and have come to Talmud in a much more balanced way. So I don't think the issue of when somebody came to Talmud really is significant in terms of legitimating him as a master or not. So I just want to put that on the record, despite the fact that Levinas's readings of Talmud do produce a truly original perspective, much as Philo did and much as Maimonides said. Thank you.